by the American Academy of Political and Social Science. So let's get started. My name is Michael Todd, and I'm the editor of Social Science Space. I have the pleasure of introducing you to our moderator today, Elizabeth Suhay. Liz Suhay is the co-editor with James N. Druckmann of the March special issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, which was titled The Politics of Science, Political Values in the Production, Communication, and Reception of Scientific Knowledge. Liz is an assistant professor in the Department of Government at American University, where she studies public opinion, political psychology, and political communication in the United States. Her current research focuses on the intersection of the public's political attitudes and their beliefs about the role genetics play in human behaviors, particularly those linked to inequality. She earned a bachelor's degree and PhD at the University of Michigan, and before coming to American last year, taught at Pennsylvania's Lafayette College. Now, this one-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will be sending out a link to view it and to access the slides to all registrants in the coming weeks. And if you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the right of your screen, and one of our helpful team members will get back to you ASAP. At the end of the webinar, we will have some time for Q&A from attendees, so please also use the Q&A box to ask any questions to speakers throughout the webinar. Please also take note of the webinar hashtag, #SocialScienceLive, and feel free to ask questions there. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Dr. Suhay.
Okay, so thank you so much for that introduction, Michael, and welcome everybody. So today I'm joined by Dan Kahan of Yale Law School and Francis Shen of the University of Minnesota Law School. I'm grateful to them both for taking the time to be with us here. So let me start by saying a little bit about Dan and Francis, explain why they are the perfect duo for this webinar. So Dan Kahan is the Elizabeth K. Dullard Professor of Law and Professor of Psychology at Yale Law School. He's a member of the Cultural Cognition Project, an interdisciplinary team of scholars who use empirical methods to examine the impact of group values on perceptions of risk and science communication. Current topics of investigation include how critical reasoning faculties relate to political conflict over science, and how evidence-based methods can be used to improve communication of science relevant to democratic decision-making. Dan's research has been published in numerous academic outlets. He's also a prolific blogger, and as many of you are likely aware, his research has gained widespread attention in the mainstream media, particularly his work related to climate change. Francis Shen is a McKnight Land-Grant Professor and Associate Professor of Law at the University of Minnesota, where he directs the Shen Neurolaw Lab. He also serves as Executive Director of Education and Outreach for the MacArthur Foundation Research Network on Law and Neuroscience. Francis conducts empirical and legal research at the intersection of law and neuroscience and is also a prolific academic author. He recently co-authored the first law and neuroscience textbook and is published on a range of neurolaw topics, including memory, lie detection, mental health, neurolegislation, criminal law, and tort law. So Dan and Francis both published articles in the March issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science that I co-edited with Jamie Druckmann. The title of that special issue is The Politics of Science, Political Values, and the Production, Communication, and Reception of Scientific Knowledge. The volume contains 16 pieces on the politics of science and is a great resource for those of you interested in learning more about some of the themes we're talking about here today. Perhaps the most important theme to emerge from that special issue, one my co-editor and I highlight in our editor's introduction, is that the intermingling of politics and science is, frankly, inevitable. So before we get started with the panelists, let me say a little bit more about this idea. Collectively, we understand the world around us, including what problems we face, who is responsible for those problems, and the best ways to solve those problems through science. While the scientific process is objective, scientific findings can actually be pretty opinionated. Frankly, they can be kind of bossy. So scientific findings provide a direction for human activity. What threatens us? Who is to blame? What should be done? Science has answers. And because science has answers, it is inherently political. Science does and should inform public policy as well as legal proceedings. For example, I think most of us would agree with this. So far, so good. But Problems arise when individuals or groups in society recognize science's authority, recognize its power to direct human activity, and try to make sure science is on their side. So let me say again, science is political, but here political takes on a different meaning. We're no longer talking about science informing policy or law. Rather, we're talking about coalitions fighting over science precisely because of its ability to inform policy and law. So these coalitions may seek to discredit science that undermines their values or interests, promote science that bolsters their values or interests, and finally, coalitions may seek to interpret, frame, or spin scientific findings in ways that are advantageous to their values or interests. Now, in the U.S. today, these coalitions fighting over science are not limited to Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals. All kinds of groups have entered the fray. Business and labor groups, religious groups, racial and gender groups, regional groups, etc. Now, as we made clear here today, this politicized behavior vis-a-vis science is not necessarily conscious on the part of these individuals. Much of what I've described goes on without the participants being aware of how their affiliations, values, and interests are influencing their receptivity to and interpretation of scientific evidence. And to my mind, it is this widespread ignorance of widespread science bias that makes efforts such as this webinar so important. In order to solve a problem, you have to first be aware of its existence. So let's move ahead to our panelists. A quick note on the structure of this webinar. Dan and Francis will each deliver PowerPoint presentations of 10 to 12 minutes. After the presentations, the three of us will engage in some discussion, and then we'll open things up to audience questions. If you have a question for the presenters, let me suggest that you submit it as early in the webinar as possible. That'll increase the likelihood we'll be able to get to your question during the short time we have here today. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Dan Kahan.
Okay, thank you very much, Liz. Since I only have 12 minutes, I thought I would limit myself basically to everything I know about climate science communication, and since that takes about 8 minutes, I would then turn to every conceivable recommendation I have on how to communicate climate science effectively. And actually, each one of those fits within just that little box that you probably see now on your screen. Although I have kind of used really small print. But just to kind of give you an overview of what I'm going to say, first, here's everything I know, everything important I know about climate science communication. Basically, what ordinary members of the public believe about climate change doesn't reflect what they know. It expresses who they are. And the recommendation, which follows from this, is don't make free reasoning people choose between being who they are and knowing what's known by science. Don't create a conflict between knowing what's known and being who you are, because that's what will make it impossible for diverse people to agree on issues like climate change. Now that's kind of general and abstract, so I thought I'd start with a simpler issue and one that was less controversial. So I'm going to talk about belief in evolution to start. Now, every I guess 18 months or so, we see this kind of result from Gallup that shows us that about 46% of the American public doesn't believe in evolution. And I think they wait about 18 months in between putting out that information because they think it takes us about that long to forget that we already know this because they've been telling this us for decades. But all the same, whenever they say this, there are these expressions of kind of shock and anxiety. What are we going to do? There must be something wrong with our science education system. I mean, Miss America doesn't know about evolution or something like this. And the truth is, maybe there are problems with our science education system, but none of them would be ones that you could assess by looking at how many people say they believe in evolution. because what people say they believe about evolution, it just doesn't measure what they know about science. And I'm going to show you some data on that, some empirical evidence in the form of an assessment of what people know about science, and then what the relationship is between how they do on that assessment and the responses to this question, what do you believe about human evolution? And the assessment I'm using is one that colleagues and I have developed to try to understand conflicts over science. And it doesn't just kind of assess an inventory of factual knowledge. Did you know that the sun goes around the earth, or the earth goes around the sun, and so forth? But it may ask questions like that, but it also measures certain kinds of reasoning proficiencies that you need to acquire more scientific information and use it. Use it in ordinary decision-making settings as a consumer of science-informed services like medical services, as somebody in an employment setting where science might be important, just as a voter on civic matters. So we call it the ordinary science intelligence assessment. And here are a couple questions. On the x-axis is how well people are doing on the test overall, and the y-axis, how likely are they to get a particular question right? So you can see how difficult particular questions are. Electrons smaller than atoms is a pretty easy question. So even people who are at the 50th percentile on this assessment, they're about 70% likely to get that one correct. Here's a fairly difficult one that involves inferential reasoning. It's a conditional probability problem. We say that there's a certain kind of medical condition, breast cancer, with a certain frequency in the population. If somebody takes an exam, it has a 95% or 90% accuracy rate and gets a positive, what's the likelihood that they have the condition? People have a lot of problem with the conditional probability. They have to do Bayesian reasoning, and basically the average person is going to get this wrong with almost no chance they'll get it right. You have to be at 90th percentile before you're likely to get that right. So it's a hard one, and it gets more weight in the assessment of whether somebody has this kind of disposition that we're measuring. Now here's the responses to the question, which is on the NSF science literacy test. Human beings as we know them today developed from earlier species of animals. And you can see it's kind of flat. At about the 50th percentile, 55% of the people say true, which is what you'd expect given the Gallup poll. But there's really not much difference in how much more or less likely people are to get it right, to say true, as you move towards the lower end of performance, the one standard deviation below the mean or one standard above. It's pretty flat. It's not like the other questions where you see that kind of sharp increase as people get better in proficiency. And here's the reason. The question is measuring arguably the science comprehension of people who are below average in religiosity. It has the kind of profile you would expect, but it's clearly not for people who are above average in religiosity. As they become better on the test overall, they're even less likely to say that they believe in evolution. And this isn't because people who are below average or above average in religiosity do differently on the test overall. I mean, it is the case that people are below average do just a tiny bit better. But what this is showing you is that conditional on getting a score in, say, the 90th percentile, how likely are you to get this one right? If you look at the other items, you can see that you don't see that disparity, right? The question, do you believe in evolution? It's not measuring the underlying comprehension of science in the same way in the two groups. I mean, this is most dramatic if you look at the conditional probability problem, the really hard one. So you have people who had a really great science teacher or math teacher, somebody who was above average in religiosity, 90th percentile, 80% likelihood to get that right. Gee, only a 25% likelihood of getting the evolution question right. This is cultural bias, not in the sense of animus, but in the sense that the group that is above average in religiosity, its disposition to understand science isn't being measured with the same precision by this question as is the proficiency of the below average religiosity group. And so they're not going to, it's going to understate the people who are above average in religiosity, how well they understand the science. Now, what is the question measuring in that group, if not their science comprehension? And I would just say it's their religiosity. And there are different ways to show this, but you can do it with an experiment. You just change the wording of the question. According to the theory of evolution, human beings as we know them today developed from an earlier species of animals. Right? Now I'm unconfounding the response that people give to this question from who are you, the kind of person who says you don't believe in evolution, to what do you know about what science knows, right? And you see that disparity essentially disappear, right? So, you know, at that point, it's just too easy a question to really matter. I mean, almost everybody can get it, but you've eliminated the disparity between the groups because now you are measuring the same thing in the two groups. Now, this has a practical implication too. If you want to teach people evolution, you have to disentangle the knowledge from the identity as well, right? So there's plenty of evidence that shows that you can teach people the kids who say they don't believe in evolution, evolution just as well as the kids who say that they do believe it. And you do it just by addressing the kind of common mistakes they make about whether evolution occurs because, say, the giraffe was stretching its neck to get the coconuts. That's not how it works. Everybody will understand it at the end of the course. But if you ask the kid then who said at the beginning, now do you believe in evolution? He or she is going to say, no, I don't. Because you were teaching that person something about what science knows. You weren't changing who that person is. And that's still what that question measures. Do you believe in evolution? Measures who you are. And in fact, according to this research, the one thing you don't want to do if you want to teach kids evolution is make them think that the issue is, do you believe in evolution? Because at that point, you're putting them to a choice between being who they are and knowing what science knows. And when you do that, they're going to push back. People will prefer being who they are than to knowing what science knows. All right, so now with my remaining 2 minutes, we're seeing the same thing with global warming. We see this kind of graph all the time, the division on belief in climate change. Is that a problem with our science education system? The answer is no. If you measure people's science comprehension with that same test, there's no population correlation between their perception of the risk of climate change and how much they know about science. This is what the question, do you believe in climate change, measures, partisanship. That's a really strong correlation, as strong a correlation between political orientation and their response to this question as the correlation between their party affiliation and their liberal and conservative ideology. It's just measuring their partisanship. And in fact, I lied to you when I said there was no correlation between their responses to this question about climate change risk and science comprehension. There's a big one. It just depends on what your political orientation is. If you're left of center, then as your science comprehension increases, you're more likely to believe in climate change. If you're right of center, you're less likely to believe. This is measuring who you are, not what you know. And in fact, you can disentangle the question from what you know, from who you are with climate change in the same way you do with the issue of evolution. I could show you a climate assessment test. There's no difference in how liberal and conservatives do. The question, do you believe in climate change? It's not responsive to how much you know about climate science. And in fact, as you know more about climate science, the more likely you are to believe if you're a liberal Democrat and less likely if you're a conservative Republican. It's measuring who you are, not what you know. And that's the problem, because in politics, we're not measuring what people know, we're measuring who people are. And the problem is how to disentangle that. The same way that we've done that in the classroom, disentangling what people know from who they are, we have to do that in politics. And that was something that I presented data on, my co-authors did, in our experimental paper in the special issue of the Annals. I wanted to tell you something about how that's being done too in Florida. I don't know if I really have enough time. except to say that if
Dan,
this is your...
if you want to take a couple minutes to talk about that, that's great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I will be happy to. This is your typical picture of what's going on in Florida. People laugh at, Rubio, what's wrong with you, and the stupid governor who bans climate change. But it's really a misleading picture. There's lots of things going on. Palm Beach County approves a climate change plan. There's been some reporting on this, too, that there's bipartisan attention to climate change issues in Southeast Florida. And I can tell you something about this because my research group does field-based studies there. The explanation isn't that people in Florida aren't polarized on climate change. If you ask them whether they believe in climate change, they give you the same answer. They tell you who they are, and they're members of these different groups as well. So you see that same pattern. But if you ask them what they know about the risks that they face, they all say, we know we face climate impact risks, and they all agree government should do something about it. And so what's to be done? I mean, basically, I just tell everything I know to the people in the Climate Compact and say, well, what do you think? This isn't going to help. No need to tell people about cars underwater. They know that. This is definitely a bad idea because it reinforces the association, the entanglement between the position, the question, do you believe in climate change and who are you? Right? Instead, they say, well, we're just going to tell them that this is a normal issue. This is us. We're working on this issue. Your neighbors are concerned about this. And this is a disentanglement strategy, right? Not us versus them, just us using what we know. Because they're changing the conversation. Right? It's a conversation about our local issues, and it's between us. And it's not in terms of who are you or whose side are you on, but what should we do about a common problem that we have? And that's a successful strategy. And the opportunities to do this are pretty readily available in many other places. So this is the question. Given that what people believe about climate change expresses who they are, how can you remove the conflict between people being who they are and knowing what's known? What kind of political engagement can you have with that issue that makes it possible for people who are going to be different kinds of people, nevertheless to recognize the best available evidence and to try to use it? And just to anticipate one question, shaming people who don't agree with you, that tends not to work.
Thank you so much, Dan. So just a quick note to the audience. If you have a question for Dan, please go ahead and send that in to Sage, and we'll try to address your question at the end of the hour during the Q&A. Next up is Francis Shen.
Well, thanks, Liz, and thank you to Sage and everyone for making this possible. It's exciting to be with you here today, and I think it's nice that I am following on Dan's work because Dan talked about climate change and climate change science, which has been with us for at least a little while, and I'm going to talk about neuroscience, which, although brain science has been with us in one form or another for centuries, the modern incarnation of neuroscience is really just arising and emerging on the scene, and what I'll talk about is how, if at all, and in what ways that neuroscience is going to move into lab and legislature, and in particular, the narratives that allow for that transition. Let me start, as I think many neuroscience discussions do, with the brain. And this is a picture of my brain, or at least, and more precisely, an image of my brain as created by a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner. It happened to be one in Santa Barbara, California in 2009. And I start here, not just because it's a cool image, though I think it is, but because I think we need to start with the question, what, if anything, does science like this offer law or offer policy? What is the value proposition? And I think there are actually many ways to answer that, and indeed it's because there are many ways to answer that, because there are many ways to frame the value proposition, that we have the opportunity, either for good or for bad, to tell different narratives for different politics to arise, and thus for different legal and social outcomes. These are the types of questions that I explore in my lab. It's called the Shen Neurolaw Lab, and I put this up because our motto is every story is a brain story, but of course every story are many other stories as well, and I think in part, picking up on what Dan just said, the point I want to make here, the big point, is that how you tell the story matters. It matters for the reception of the science in a legislature and in a legal setting, and ultimately, therefore, it matters for what, if anything, that science accomplishes. I only have about a few more minutes here, 10 in total, but I want to give you one resource if you're interested in these topics. I'll just mention it now and not again, but it's lawneuro.org. It's a website run by the MacArthur Foundation Research Network on Law and Neuroscience, of which I'm affiliated, and it has a compendium of a number of resources on these and related topics. So if you're interested in neuroscience and policy and neuroscience and law, check it out. So let's get on to the heart of what I want to do, and I just want to make 3 points. The first one is, I think, the least controversial, and that is simply that the brain has taken center stage. Brain science is all around us. I'll make that point. I'll then ask, well, so what? What, if any, connection is there between that emerging brain science and legislative behavior and the law? And then finally, with the look to the future and with the discussion of the politics, and in particular the paper that my colleague Dina Gromay of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and I have in this special edition of the Annals, I'm thinking about what might be some good paths forward. But let's start with this first point. The brain takes center stage. We don't have to look far, and indeed I think we can simply rip from the headlines enough information to convince us all that brain science is all around. We can start at the top of the food chain. President Obama is not a neuroscientist, but he likes them. And in 2013, he announced a new brain initiative, brain research through advancing innovative neurotechnologies. They've invested hundreds of millions of dollars, as have many other both private and public partnerships, and there's clearly a future on the research side, on the clinical side. Closer to home, you can walk into your local bookstore and find many brain and mind books, including one of my favorite just from its title, Neurobic Exercises. Apparently there are 83 and available in 22 languages. So this is a worldwide phenomena. You can walk through CVS and Walgreens and find things like NeuroMax, NeuroOptimizer, NeuroClear, Neuro1, Mental Performance Formula, and no, I have no idea what these do. As an aside, neither does the FDA, though they're starting to look at whether they should regulate supplements like this. It's a different story, but the point is that they're there, and boy, they're even there at the breakfast you ate this morning. You thought you were just eating a good old banana, but in fact, those bananas are now being marketed, and this is actually taken a shot from what you'll see at a grocery store in some places, brain fuel. So the point here is simply that we're seeing brain science all around, and as we see it more in society, we're starting to think about its implications for law and policy. Liz mentioned at the beginning there's a new course book that I had the honor of co-authoring with 2 colleagues at Vanderbilt, Owen Jones and Jeff Shaw, called Law and Neuroscience. It's 800 pages, so I won't bother to summarize it, but I'll just give you a sense of the ways in which the brain, as evidence in a courtroom, might change the way we do law. For instance, it might change the way we assess criminal defendants. It might change the way that we assess in civil cases whether someone has pain or is just faking. It might change the way we address mental health and mental illness, communicate with those at brain death, think about fetal pain at the beginning of life, and so on and so forth. You may have seen some of these things in your own headlines. For instance, the current trial of the Boston Marathon bomber and whether or not he will get the death penalty has involved testimony about his brain and the juvenile brain more broadly. We've seen similar types of cases where someone claims my brain made me do it, or did my neurons make me do it, and we've seen it in many non-criminal contexts as well, most prominently, for instance, concussions and youth concussions and sports. So we're seeing this all over the place. And again, questions are being raised about what, if anything, neuroscience adds to the mix. So I want to talk about the narratives that make this link from brain science into law and policy. And I think they're important because although there is great promise in advances that we might make in the law and in policy, there is also great peril, especially from premature and inappropriate uses. It's only a few decades ago that the use of the frontal lobotomy, which by the way won a Nobel Prize, was in vogue, and only a few decades before that that phrenology was considered by many a valid science. Both are now discredited, thankfully, but only after much harm was done. So the stakes are high, and I think that means that the stakes are high for the narrative we tell. Again, the basic question is, how does something from a lab a neuroscience lab or any other science lab actually end up in a state house like this one, or in Congress or in a courtroom. And I want to suggest to you that there are many actors along the way. Just to briefly sketch out a model as we look at this arrow going from lab to law and legislation, I'll point out some of the major actors in constructing the narrative. I should footnote and mention that if we had longer time, we could talk about the arrow that goes back and the way in which, especially at the federal level, but state too, members of Congress enable or hinder research or channel that research into particular areas or prohibit research in particular areas. An important related part of the story, but let's focus on this part, which says, how do you make these interpretations at the lab? Well, there are lawyers involved in their version of neuroscience, certainly lobbyists. There is the lay public, and some of Dan's work talks about this as well, some data that I'll present in a moment. And then what do legislators and their staff ultimately think about this neuroscience? Crucially, and this is an important point, it's not the case, I have found very little evidence that any of these groups, even those with an interest in the science, are themselves reading issues of Nature or Science or the proceedings of the National Academy of Science. Rather, there is an intermediary set of groups, prominently the media, schools for early training, and then direct outreach by professional organizations and individuals that mediate the conversation between basic science and applied policymaking. Now, we don't have time to talk about how all of these individual pieces interrelate and work together, but let me just make the point that however they're working together, they're producing some changes in the way that policy is made. Here's data from a paper that we've got looking at state legislatures and their bills related to neuroscience, and we've got some comparable data from the federal level. The point that you'll see from this trend is that there are more of these brain-related bills showing up. To date, legislatures have been interested in issues such as Alzheimer's, brain injury, early childhood interventions, healthcare, juvenile justice, mental health, sports concussions, amongst others, but that field of issues may expand or contract in the future, again, depending on how things are framed. So how does the framing affect both current policymaking and especially the future of neuroscience and law? Well, to answer that question, my colleague Dina Gramea, I mentioned before, at Wharton, and I conducted a study, and what we wanted to look at was how does the lay public understand neuroscience and neuroscience-based legal reforms, and how might that understanding be tweaked by the narrative that is provided to them, by the way that the issue is framed. And there's both, I think, a good news and a bad news. The good news is that we have a sense right now that the American public is pretty neutral with regards to neuroscience, in part because they don't yet know a lot about it. And this is data which suggests that just in terms of self-reported data, we don't have good indices the way that some of Dan's indices work, but you just ask people, how knowledgeable would you say about science? You get roughly, and this is the green bars, a normal distribution. You know, most in the middle, some a little more, some a little less. If, however, you ask, how knowledgeable would you say you are about neuroscience, things are skewed to the left. A vast majority of the population readily admits that they don't know much about neuroscience, and this is understandable because it's complex and it's new. So there's a bit of a blank slate. In addition, we find that at least right now, if you just ask individuals, this is still part of the good news story, about their approval of neuroscience-based legal reforms, they're in a wait-and-see attitude. The majority and the modal response from independents, Democrats, and Republicans is, I neither approve nor disapprove of neuroscience-based legal reforms. And again, I think that makes sense because we just don't exactly know what those are. And again, this is, I think, all good news because it suggests that we're not yet in a position where asking someone about neuroscience-based legal reforms forces a choice between, to use Dan's terminology, who you are and what you know. But could that change? This was the point of our study, and we found that it might. What I'm showing you now is data that represents results from 3 different experimental conditions. We've got a nationally representative sample of Americans. The control group, those are the light blue bars, were simply asked, again as before, about their approval of neuroscience-based legal reforms. However, the sort of red bar there, a prosecution frame, and then the purple bar, defense frame, changed things about. And because it's been suggested that neuroscience may aid either the prosecution in a criminal context or the defense, we said to folks, and we frame this as neuroscience is potentially going to help defense lawyers, that's the defense frame, And then we asked a separate group, what would you think if neuroscience were going to aid prosecutors? And here, then we begin to see a difference. Both Republicans and independents are more reluctant to support such reforms when they think that it's going to help, and this is the right bars, the defense, as opposed to just not help either side, be neutral, or help the prosecution. So what does this mean for the future? Well, I think it means a couple of things. First of all, I think it means that neuroscience is still, and neuroscience-based legal reforms, still ripe for shaping, which is great. I think we can learn from other instances, for instance, climate science, for what to do and what not to do, though I'm not entirely sure what predictions to make, and I'll leave you with this thought for why I'm hesitant. Bill Gates has said about technological change that, quote, people often overestimate what will happen in the next 2 years and underestimate what will happen in 10. End quote. And I think that's a useful way to view neurolaw because, you know, some of this brain science stuff in 2 years, it's going to look the same. But in a decade, we may have seen some tremendous breakthroughs that could really shake things up. So with that change and recognizing that, you know, politics changes week to week, month to month, let alone decade to decade, combining those two realms of uncertainty seems to me to give us a future that is remarkably fluid. So things are unpredictable, but to me that's what makes it fun, and I hope that we'll all remain a part of the conversation and, crucially, that we'll all work to form the right and the most productive narratives about neuroscience and about science more generally. So thanks, and I look forward to all of our discussion.
All right, thank you so much, Francis. Again, to the audience, if you have questions for Francis, for Dan, or all of us, please go ahead and send that to Sage. We're going to start the audience Q&A in a few minutes, but first we are going to have a few minutes of panelist discussion, and I put together some questions I wanted to ask of the panelists that I thought the audience might be interested in. So let me start with a general question, and given Francis's presentation, this is a little bit less relevant to neuroscience, but I think still has some relevance to biological science more broadly. So there's a perception that science bias is more of a problem today than it was in the past, and I wanted to ask you both why you think this is. Is it that science has become more salient in more areas of our lives and this leads to more opportunity for bias, or all else equal, is there some reason why individuals have become more extreme in their science bias, or maybe there's no increase in science bias at all and we've just become more aware of it? So I wanted to ask your thoughts on this perception that science bias is more of a problem today than it was in the past.
Yeah. Well, it might depend on what you mean by science biased, but and this probably isn't what you mean. But I know a lot of people have the perception that there's hostility to science, or a kind of growing public resentment, and I actually think that's clearly false. People express extremely positive views about science, and they have been for decades on the kinds of questions that assess their attitudes in the general social survey, or Pew does regular surveys and so forth. And on all these kinds of contested issues, people on both sides perceive that the positions of their group are consistent with what scientific consensus are, and they're all right about a third of the time. But what we do see is a lot more conflict about science, and a lot more kind of spectacular instances of people using what presumably are the normal ways that they always have to figure out what's known by science, disagreeing when they have these diverse identities. To me, that is the entanglement issue I was talking about. People figure out what's known by science inside of these affinity groups. That's where they hang out. That's where they can understand what people are saying. And usually they converge on positions on what's known by science, except sometimes when these positions on these issues become entangled in identities in a way that makes them into badges of membership and loyalty in these groups. Then you see this kind of persistent conflict. Now the question whether that's happening more often, maybe it is. I mean, maybe that's a consequence of polarization generally. But it's hard to know because, you know, we tend to observe only the numerator, right, not the denominator. We don't stand by the highway and watch all the cars go by that don't crash. We just notice the car wrecks. And these are some pretty consequential ones. So I'm not sure about the relative frequency. But I would say, too, that what we've seen with some of these controversies shows that these kinds of issues, they're not inevitable. They can be understood and sometimes foreseen and avoided. And so if we can develop better understandings of why we get this kind of pathology of the entanglement of the positions with the identities, and try to do things that in our political practices that minimize the likelihood of that happening, clearly everybody will be better off.
Thanks. And I
fMRI's back me up on that, right, Francis?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, Francis, you have thoughts on this?
Well, I'll just say just very briefly that I, at least from the law side and kind of the policy-making side, I think there may be a number of instances where the bias might float in a different way. That is, the addition of a quote-unquote scientific basis for an argument is, for a variety of reasons, seen as necessarily stronger, and so there are a number of interested parties who look to neuroscience and genetics and other places to bolster their argument with science, and sometimes they're right, but sometimes the science there is not as strong as they think for their particular purposes.
Okay. So these are actually convenient responses because they're both leading me to some specific questions for both of you. And let's see. So given that Francis was just speaking, let me direct this question to you, which is quite related to something you just said. So it does strike me that in today's media discussion about science bias, so often we're preoccupied with skepticism toward science. The term science denial is used a lot. But as you know, there's an opposite kind of bias as well in some instances where people put too much stock in empirical studies, maybe overvaluing a single study that may not replicate, or exaggerating studies' claims regarding cause and effect. And this seems to be especially true for some reason, and you hinted at this during your presentation, this seems to be especially true of neuroscientific and biological studies. And I wanted to ask you, those brain scans, you know, are so darn seductive. And so I wanted to ask you your thoughts on why this may be, why people are so drawn in by neuroscientific and biological studies, even if it's just, you know, a single study with some fairly weak results. And then, you know, in addition, how can we educate people to consume such studies more responsibly? That's the big one. Start with why this happens.
Sure. So 2 points. One is that I think there may be a limited set of circumstances under which the brain science, or more generally biological explanations, are seen as especially persuasive. There's actually a mixed bag of evidence, some of which I've contributed to, that suggest under a number of conditions the so-called, you know, a halo effect of this effect. It just isn't there, and in particular under conditions of adversarial presentation of evidence. So, and it's the experience that some jurors have just in general, where they feel after one side makes the case, wow, of course I see it that way, but then the other side makes the case, and with another set of experts or with cross-examination, and you begin to see that maybe the evidence isn't what it isn't what it at least was thought to be at the beginning. So I think it's still an open question as to the extent of the persuasion. Okay. I do think, though, there are some instances where just generally, and in terms of informing treatment or legal or policy outcomes, this type of evidence broadly, and I would say broadly, you know, biological, not just neuroscientific, is persuasive. And I think it has something to do, although this is not very well defined, with the intimacy of the type of evidence, and that may sound weird given that it's very technological and almost inaccessibly so complicated, but there is something intimate about evidence coming from the brain, or coming from our own genes, our own DNA, if you will. And I think it's an open question, both an empirical one and sort of a social one, as to why that's happening. But The answer, I think, to get to the final part of your question, and this reflects, I think, my legal background, is that I like the adversarial model. I think that there's no way you're going to reduce or change the incentives of some to put information out there framed a certain way, maybe not the most beneficial. So it's going to be out there, and you've got to have the other side or other multiple sides out there as well. And I think the informed consumer will, in fact, not be so misinformed when they have these variety of frames and perspective to see. And I think we've got some evidence that that's true, at least in the juror context.
That's fantastic to know. Occasionally we figure out that our system is doing something right, so this is wonderful. So let me stick with Francis for a moment, and then I'm going to bounce back to Dan. Thinking about the competence of individuals in our legal system as well as legislators with respect to brain science. You suggested that folks in these areas are deciding legal cases, arguing legal cases. They're making law without much knowledge at all about brain science, right? Even though that in some cases they're asked to assess such evidence. I wanted to ask you whether you have any recommendations for people in the legal field, for legislators or both. You mentioned the important role of mediators, media, schools, different folks doing outreach in trying to provide some context for such individuals. But it seems to me like we might also ask that legislators, legal professionals have some specific training in the brain sciences. So I just wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on this issue.
My thoughts are twofold. The first is that I think there are a number of efforts underway. They're almost all small but passionate to improve the education and outreach to the judiciary, to staff members of legislators. And I think those efforts should be ongoing, and I'm sure they will. And not just in neuroscience, but broadly across sciences, from genetically modified crops to climate change and the like. And I think those efforts are important. The other thing institutionally that I think could change, and again, we actually see this in a variety of ways, is that to take science out of some of the public realm and put it into, for instance, administrative bodies, or bodies that are less likely to be directly affected by the political sphere. I think that's a careful balance, because you've got to have democratic responsibility and accountability on the one hand. On the other hand, there may be ways in which the administration of some of the public machinery may be able to integrate and understand more carefully and more effectively science across a broad array of areas, if they don't have some of those public pressures bearing down on them every 2 years or every 4-year election cycle.
Thanks. I'm going to ask one more question and I'm going to ask Dan this question, and then we've got some audience questions coming in. Dan, I wanted to ask you something that you touched on, and I'm sure you've given this some thought. I'm sure people have asked you this already. There's this problem with the entanglement of factual belief and cultural identity, which you talk a lot about. And one of the things you really focused on today was, if we want to understand how much people really know about science, we just have to ask questions more carefully, right, and separate belief from identity. I wanted to go beyond that and ask you, is there any way to prevent the entanglement of factual belief and cultural identity in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is.
I mean, you touched on this. Yeah.
This is the question about standing by the highway, and the ignored denominator. The number of issues that have this kind of profile, where people with different identities end up polarized, and not only that, but polarized to even a greater extent as their reasoning proficiencies increase, is tiny in relation to the number of issues in which that doesn't happen, but it very well could. I mean, in fact, we're not polarized in the United States on GM foods, even though people tend to think we are, and they are in Europe. We could be polarized on things like exposure to medical X-rays. I mean, their radiation, and there's a reason why they wear the lead apron in front of their privates and so forth. What happens here? It isn't that people are learning more about the science. If only the climate scientists were as good as the biologists were explaining pasteurization of milk, you know, we wouldn't have this problem. People aren't getting the information from scientists; they're getting it from other people like them, and the people who are like them are agreeing with the people who aren't like them about what it is that science knows. And so the question is, why do some issues go down this track where the positions become entangled in identity and some don't? A really great example is the HPV vaccine. And after the fact, everybody goes, well, that's obvious because it deals with a sexually transmitted disease, and you're talking about young girls and parental autonomy. Well, the HBV vaccine for the hepatitis B is for sexually transmitted disease. At the very time that we were fighting about the HPV vaccine, states had adopted the HBV vaccine as a adolescent vaccination. It's now an infant vaccination, but it had been approved at a time where there had to be the catch-up for the people in middle schools. And there was 95% uptake vaccination rates across all the states that then were rejecting the HPV vaccine. And why did one end up one way and one the other? And I think the answer is that HPV vaccine was marketed in a way deliberately by its manufacturer to try to get control of the market before its competitor would enter, that maximized the likelihood it would become entangled in politics. The manufacturer went right to the state legislatures and tried to get the mandates. Normally what happens is that independent health administrators kind of get the memo from the CDC and outside the spotlight, you know, they just add these things, and it's not very, you know, fun to fight about what the health administrator is doing. But when something's in the legislature, then you've got raw materials for groups that want to create conflict to try to bring this to people's attention. They're learning about it at that point from MSNBC or from Fox News or in other places of conflict, and they're learning basically our side says this and their side says that. With the HBV vaccine, they learned about this information from their doctor, and their doctor might have had their cultural values too, but doctors with different values didn't disagree that this was something you should be doing, and so people with those values tended to converge. And these were things, actually, developments people could have foreseen at the time. They did foresee at the time. They even did studies at the time that said something like this could happen. The information wasn't rejected so much as just kind of launched into empty space. There's no mechanism for trying to make sense of this, to forecast these kinds of issues, and to treat the knowledge asset, you know, as it progresses through the system in a way that reflects the kind of fragility of it and the value of it. So yeah, if this happens again, we shouldn't blame interest groups and corporations, and we should blame ourselves, you know, for not doing something that makes us more intelligent about these dynamics.
Right, depoliticizing from the get-go. I would love to talk more about that, but I want to get to a couple of questions that I have here from audience members. So the first one I think is more appropriate for Dan. So thinking about public confusion over the issue of climate change and other controversial science topics, somebody asks whether the confusion may not be science or religion, but rather economics and math. So I'm just going to read what this person wrote here. If the Pope and other religious leaders promote climate change and get rejected, maybe it's because people can't perceive the calculations of cost benefit appropriately.
I guess, although you know, it's not clear to me why. I mean, the main division on climate change is partisan. I mean, and I think too, using the partisan measure, the religion measure, these are all just alternative indicators to me for some kind of a group affinity. But the group affinity is not one that has to do with economics. It's not one that has to do with math. And in fact, the people who are the most science proficient, the ones you would expect to be most able to understand the data, and also the ones who we know through behavioral economics are least likely to be over-relying on heuristic kinds of reasoning that tend to make them discount future risks. They're the most polarized too. So it's hard to explain individual opinions on the basis of the economic stakes people have. I mean, in fact, there's no economic consequence whatsoever in your individual opinion on climate change because you can't influence it. Nothing you do as a consumer, nothing you do as a voter, nothing you do as somebody who argues with other people about it is going to actually affect how much carbon we're emitting or what policies we adopt. You just don't matter enough. But if you make a mistake about this issue with respect to what it signifies about what kind of person you are, then it has tremendous consequences. And people do have these identities. So I think the problem isn't too little rationality, it's too much. People are too good at understanding what the significance of information on this issue is for their standing in their group. It's not stupid people. It's a polluted communication environment. Stupid, not to call anybody stupid. But if you put people in a condition, in a situation where the position on these issues has a bigger impact on them because of their status in the community than it has for public policy insofar as they can influence it, why isn't it rational for them to process the information that way? You've got to fix that environment so that you don't create an incentive to process the information in a way that protects your group identity that's in conflict with what would otherwise be the normal way in which you converge on what science knows.
Right. Let me ask one more question. We are almost out of time, but I want to get this in. It's a really good one. It comes in from Mark. He asks, he starts with, the lobotomy was revered once. Now it's dismissed as ridiculous. How does science respond to criticisms, particularly from the religious, that today's scientific truth may one day be found to be ridiculous? So therefore, science and religion, in a sense, belong on the same footing in school curricula, etc. He's not stating that, he's asking that. So Francis, maybe you want to take this first. This is a very good question, and you do see a lot of science skeptics bringing up this idea that former supposed truths are now found to be not true, and it makes people doubt our current scientific knowledge.
Well, a couple of replies. Good question. In terms of looking backwards at science, in some ways, the scientific project is to show that at least certain aspects of what we once knew, certainly in the clinical realm, would now be ridiculous. So no one would want to have their broken arm treated the way that we would have treated it 100 years ago and the like. That said, I do think it's a great point that how is it that we know that a particular type of science is ready for a particular type of use, either in the clinical stream, the social stream, the political stream, the legal stream? We have in place some institutions that try and do that on the consumer side, like the FDA, but we certainly need to be cautious, and I think the tack that a lot of us in the field have tried to take is to pitch down the middle, not to be overly excited, but to at the same time not be overly cautious if indeed there are things warranted. But the lobotomy is a great example because there was a Nobel Prize awarded in 1949, and you might think that that would be an indicator that something is ready. So we've got our work cut out for us, but being cautious and being upfront and being transparent are all ways that we can try to harness the power of science without going down the wrong path.
Can I make one quick one at that, Liz, too?
Sure.
It's not science's understanding that is at all embarrassed by by revision of these views. Science's understanding of what knowledge is inherently provisional. It's only our best assessment of what the current state of the evidence is. And you shouldn't credit anything that isn't open to challenge and revision. The question is whether you can do better than relying on science's best understanding, even given that it's provisional. And I don't think science and religion are in this tremendous conflict. I see religious people relying on science, medical science, and all kinds of science as much as anybody else. We live in a relatively religious society. But if you look at the alternatives to science, science's way of knowing, they haven't done nearly as well. They're not, and I don't know if they're progressive at all. But the question is, what's your best option? Relying on our best current understanding, which is very much open to revision, or something else? So that, I think that's the right question. And I don't think that these people who say this about science, well, don't believe it because it could be wrong, they're not really a meaningful part of the kinds of conflicts that we're having about science today. We're a society that believes in science. And the sad thing is that we're just not agreeing on what it is that we think science is telling us. We have to figure out a way to make the processes by which people are able to recognize and give effect to the best evidence work as reliably as they can. That's what the issue is.
Right, right, and I agree. Science is certainly fallible. It's set up to be fallible, but it's the best we've got. And I just, for anybody interested in exploring this idea further, there's actually a great piece by the philosopher Heather Douglas in the Annals volume, again called the Politics of Science, where she deals with this very issue and talks about the difference between religion and science. So on that note, we're going to wrap things up. So thank you everyone for spending the hour with us today. I hope you'll follow along with this conversation. You can find Dan at culturalcognition.net and follow him on Twitter at cult_cognition. You can follow me on Twitter at Liz_Suhay, and you can find Francis at fxshen.com. Hang on for just a couple more minutes for some housekeeping items from Michael. So thanks again for joining us.
Well, that's just about all the time we have for today, folks. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and a special thank to our moderator and our speakers. In the coming weeks, please be on the lookout for an email that includes a link to the entire webinar and slides, as well as answers to some of the questions that we did not have time to get to today. And please feel free to share this fabulous resource with friends and colleagues who couldn't join us today. In the meantime, thank you for attending our webinar, and we hope you will join us again soon. Good day.